Hello and welcome to week 3 of our revision videos for GCSE Sociology. This week in year 9 we started with social processes, essentially what's changed over time. We picked the two examples of the Industrial Revolution and the 1960s. We watched two different videos on those periods and we looked at how the eras affected British society massively. The changes in family life, living conditions, class and power, leisure time. What people did for jobs, what they did in their free time, how much money they had, how much kind of power and status in society they had, and what that meant. We looked at why we compare different eras and what it can tell us about society by measuring the changes, by looking at how norms and values have shifted, and what social processes have caused that. Again, we applied this to Arcadia's idea, who was affected most and why, and it showed exactly why we do a lot of what we do in sociology when it comes to analysing different groups, different ideas, different beliefs, and measuring those. We also looked at some timelines to help us do this. In our next lesson, we looked at social consensus. We took the functionalist ideas, what we called the organic model, and we compared society to the human body. We looked at how all the different parts of the human body are held together and how they interact, and we talked about how norms and values are like the skin of the human body, the thing that holds all of the organs in place, and what happens if certain organs don't work. We discussed whether that was a good analogy, whether that worked or not, and we had some really interesting discussions. We then looked at different debates and how people can have a consensus or not. So we looked at controversial ideas such as the death penalty, the nuclear family, school rules, linking it to our social control lesson from the other day. We then applied these ideas to how we decide what society should be like. So we talked about democracy in our country versus other countries such as China, where they don't have democracy in the same way, what our laws and criminal justice system show us, and how making things illegal or making them legal again can show a change in values. We looked at how social media and the media in general presents ideas in society and how that can shape discussions around what we want and what we agree on and what we don't agree on. And then the types of jobs that people do, the way they earn their money and what we agree is fair and what is right, and the status that we put around different types of work. In year 10, we've looked at all the different beliefs around education, a quick summary lecture and note taking, and then we moved on to essay writing. So we started with the functionalist ideas and why they're so positive about education. All of these you can see in my other videos, which are specifically about functionalism or specifically about education. But we covered Parsons, Durkheim, and how functionalists are very positive about education, preparing us for the adult life, and education being very good for society, and linking it to the bridge analogy, social stability and cohesion, socialization, meritocracy, all of those keywords again. The contrast to functionalist beliefs are obviously Marxist beliefs, as they are in most modules, and we looked at Willis's study compared to Bowles and Gintis's study, how Marxists don't necessarily agree completely. One obviously, in Willis's case, studying working class people, or working class boys, in England in the 70s, Bowles and Gintis looking at America as a general case study. We talked about the correspondence principle and how accurate that was, whether or not school actually socializes people or whether it just prepares you for a job, really I should say, prepares you for work and makes you a good worker. We then finished this off with feminist beliefs about education and how they were more general because there's not a specific study on the spec. We talked about different subjects being gendered and whether they were girls or boys subjects, and there was some sort of debate about sociology and other subjects as well. And we talked about results and the perceptions and stereotypes around education for the genders and what they meant to you. Had some really good discussions there, and obviously linked that to adult life and things like the gender pay gap and what that really means, and patriarchy and how we can interpret that, and then brought it back to functionalist and Marxist beliefs again. We then moved on to exam technique, and we wrote this essay about whether or not education has a positive function in society. We looked at bugging the question. Obviously we talked about the fact, discuss how far sociologists agree is the prefix for all of our questions, so we can ignore that to some extent, take that for granted. Underline the keywords education and positive function, because that's what it's talking about. And then our technique of showing both sides, rewording the question, defining the question almost for the examiner, writing a appeal about functionalism for one side of the argument, and then writing a appeal about Marxism or feminism for a second side of the argument, and that providing us all with some decent marks. And we did that into time conditions. We then looked at peeling again at the end, as it were, and maybe having a third paragraph, including one of the other conflict sociologists maybe, and summing up the most important part and why it was the most important part, whether or not education was positive. And we talked about how important a conclusion was to get those top marks. That was really good, and we did one draft under time conditions, and a lot of people wrote some very good things because of that. Year 10 and Year 11 have both done this save, erase, develop technique now. This wasn't something that I came up with, so a big thanks to Shortcuts TV, someone I recommend you all follow on social media for any sociology needs at all, and some psychology. But this is a really brilliant technique, and I've been really proud of you guys who have used this. I haven't read an essay yet really that didn't go up a grade, or at least some marks, from doing this. So we saved all of the information that we wanted to keep in our essays in one highlighted colour. We put a red line through anything that we thought didn't need to be there, anything that was irrelevant, a lot of the waffle and things that often happens when you write in time conditions for the first time. And then students annotated what they wanted to keep and built upon that, and we developed that with a second highlighter colour too. Then we redrafted their essays under time conditions again, and all of the ones that I've read so far and all the ones that I've marked in Year 10 and 11 have seen massive improvements. So well done everyone, that was really positive. So always remember this technique and start to use it at home too if you want to practice for the exams. In Year 11 we started to look at Marx's ideas around social stratification and class and status and power, as we have with other sociologists. This lesson was really successful because you guys cut these shapes out, you wrote around them, you used different colours in some cases, you used the textbook to fill in ideas, you annotated the cartoons and the quotes, and got down a lot of what I think is quite difficult language in some respects. And we talked about whether Marx was still valid today, and you made some really good revision notes from what I could see. When I went through your books, they were really impressive in some cases. So let me know how you found this, and if you want to do this again with other sociologists, you want to do this before the exams. I thought from what I saw it helped quite a lot of you really organise your thoughts and really put together what's quite a tough lesson in some respects and quite a lot of tough material, particularly at GCSE. So go over these shapes, look at the key terms again, remind yourself of terms like polarisation, alienation, there's negative effects upon the worker and the working classes as a whole, conflict within it, division of labour, means of production, they're just fancy ways of saying who does what and how the job is done. So actually Marx, when you break it down, is very accessible because it's a very simple proletariat, bourgeoisie type choice, but some of these terms can catch you out, so remind yourself of those and make sure you've learned them. We also watched two videos in this lesson, one on the miners' strike in South Wales in the 80s, and we talked about how that could be applied to Marxism long after Marx's death, and the uprising in Tiananmen Square and the differences between the two governments, the two societies, and the violence and the stigma around both of those events, both of those periods, and the different cultures, different contexts for those, but how they both link to Marxism. So remember, communism was inspired by Marx, and communism came out of Marx long after he died in the 20th century, really, in the modern term at least, the way people would know it. And that's what China is under now. And we had the recent demonstrations in Hong Kong, which we talked about, and the way Tiananmen Square is not talked about in China is pretty much a taboo subject, versus the treatment of workers in Wales and the north of England, and the Thatcher government and what that meant, and the clash between Marxist ideas and Thatcher's background as neoliberal and close to the new right ideas of the 1980s. So there's a lot there, and you probably won't need all of that in massive detail, but if you can familiarise yourself with it and make sure you have a basic grasp of these different conflicts in society over time and how they link to Marx's ideas, that will definitely help you get a top grade. Our final lesson this week for Year 11 was then Max Weber's views on class and how he came along after Marx and was critical of some of Marx's ideas and built upon them. And if you remember, I said that Weber was probably the most interesting sociologist from my perspective, in my personal opinion, when it comes to this topic, because he talks about the interaction between class, power and status and how they link together, and one can affect the other, and one changing can affect the others changing. So we talked about his definitions of class, power and status and what that meant for social stratification, and why that maybe undid a lot of what Marx said about two classes, and how that compared to the 7 social classes today, and Weber's idea of an expanding middle class, and how that could actually help the 7 social classes, and maybe the idea of 7 social classes proves Weber right, and vice versa. So we looked at that, we marked an essay on it and criticised that, and we looked at different elements of the job market and why the job market shows that class, power and status can all be affected by one another and be reflected in our professions and how the world sees us. Inspired by Marx and by Weber, I asked you to design your own perfect society and look at all these different elements within a society and what you would put there and why. We talked about ideas of authority, establishment, immigration, nationalism and the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic is Weber's real famous work, if you like, and it's one that I had to read at university, and it's a very, very difficult text probably these days to read, but it's very interesting in some respects. And we talked about how Weber's argument around religion inspiring a different mentality, a different mindset, and that promoted wealth generation and changing people's class and creating a new class and a new society within Europe, and that linked directly to capitalism. And so we some people are asking about, well, Weber spans a much bigger period than Marx, if you like. Marx really talks about the Industrial Revolution, and Weber makes links before and after that as well, some might argue. So if you're really, really interested, I do recommend looking into Weber further and looking into him in great detail. That will be way beyond the scope of GCSE, but it may help you with this whole topic more, particularly those of you that are really ambitious and want to chase those top grades in every single topic, every single exam paper. Lastly, do go back over the key terms from all the modules we've talked about today. And this week we've been really successful across all 3 years. I've seen some excellent work, some excellent effort, so do keep that up.